I was like 10 or 11, and I was in the woods behind my grandpa's ranch with two of my cousins. It was just after lunch, and it was light out. We were poking a dead cat with some sticks when we saw a alien or some kind of monster. I don't know what the fuck it was. It was white and had big eyes, and it tilted its head slightly when we saw it. I was too busy screaming and running for my life to get a good look at it, but that's what I saw. It was just some kind of creature crouching there by a big tree staring at us, and all three of us saw it. We got back to the ranch and we were all crying and screaming, so my uncle took his shotgun and told us to take him to where the creature was. I didn't want to go back, and neither did my little cousins, but my older cousin was more than ready to agree as long as he could get a shotgun too. So they went back, and of course the thing was nowhere to be found. No one believes us to this day, and my uncle insists that we must have seen some kind of animal, but there was no frickin' way that it was an animal, unless it was a deformed, hairless monkey. It didn't look anything like those grey aliens or anything that I've ever seen. Its head was like kind of triangular, and its eyes were round. The closest thing I can think of is a praying mantis, but it was the size of a small child, and from what I could see it was pure white. I didn't see any limbs or anything like that I can remember. I could just see what looked like a head, a neck and torso, or something like that, I suppose. I don't frickin' know. Just thinking about it is freaking me out again. Just screw that thing, or whatever it was. So, a few years ago, I'm camping with some friends at a local lake, with a several-mile trail that wraps around it. Near the end of our day hike, we sat down to eat a quick meal, and we were intersected by a guy on a mountain bike. He seemed to have a bloody nose, and just kept going. We didn't think much of it, so we just kept eating. 15 minutes later, we have eaten, and we start embarking on the night hike. And as we walked around the path, we noticed that we never saw the biker. 15 minutes isn't really long enough for them to get too far away from us. The trail isn't the best for bikes, so it was kind of odd to think that this individual has just seemingly vanished. We didn't see him turn around and go past us to go out the exit, which was pretty close to us at the time. And the way that the path was, it's not likely that he could have easily turned around or gone through the forest a different way. We have no idea what happened to him, but we really believe that we were the last people to see him alive. We don't know if hogs or wolves got him, but we are adamant that he never left that trail. Kia ora kahoa. Grim here. And hello, everyone, to this hopefully helpful sleep video. Today we are going to be listening to almost too many dark wood stories. I have put together 15, and we have a special guest by the name of Phoenix Fire joining after this little announcement for one of their own stories as well. I hope that this is something that you have enjoyed me doing once a week. I'm planning to increase the number of uploads. I'm going to stick to, for now, a sleep release while I work on some other projects, just so everyone still gets that, chattering of my teeth as I tell you some tales. Well, I don't want to drag this out for too long, as we all know I have a habit of talking too much. But, I hope that everyone enjoys this, and at the end, as for the last few videos, there will be about an hour or so of rain following afterwards. Well, as always, please continue to listen, sit back, relax, and try to sleep.
In 2020, my mom and I decided to go on an overnight camping trip together on the Oregon coast. I picked what looked like a pretty campsite from a campsite app, and off we went. When we got there, we realized it was right off the highway, but there were enough trees and fence up front that you couldn't really see the road. But the gate was just a metal gate that swung into place. No locks. There was a house on either side, but the property was fenced in on both sides. We pitched the tent pretty far back, close to the woods on the back of the property. The closest house was about 100 yards away, and the highway was about 200 yards. But again, it was all mostly fenced in and surrounded by tall firs. It was a lovely sight, and my mom raved about how beautiful and peaceful it was. I will say that I got a feeling of dread as soon as we walked onto the property, but we arrived late, and I didn't know if we'd be able to get a new spot quickly. My mom could tell I was nervous, but for some reason, I put her enjoyment of the beauty of the campsite over my feeling of dread. We made a nice campfire and enjoyed some hot chocolate as we watched the fire. I kept an eye out and didn't see or hear anything odd. If I recall correctly, my mom went to bed before I did, and I stayed up and watched the fire for a long time before going to bed. Finally, I tucked in, very exhausted from staying up. At about 2 a.m., I awoke to twigs snapping and what sounded like someone dragging their fingers on the side of the tent, up to the front. I sat up and grabbed my phone and the only weapon I had, a large flashlight, and unzipped my sleeping bag in case I needed to fight anyone. There was a full moon that night, and I couldn't tell if it was a person's shadow falling on the tent or if it was a tree branch shadow moving from the wind. It sounded like there were two people outside trying to be quiet. We had brought our boots inside, so there was no indicator outside of who was in the tent. It felt like they were trying to gauge the tent while I was listening for where they were. I had made sure to make enough noise so they knew someone was inside, was alert. But no more than that. If they knew someone is awake, they can't surprise us. But they also don't know who is inside and whether or not we have guns. I sat there in the dark until dawn. My mom slept through the whole thing. When we got up and out of the tent, small things had been moved. Our camp chairs had cup holders. One cup had been in a cup holder was on the ground. A pen that had been in a cup holder was also on the ground. My mom raves about how good her sleep was and how refreshing it was to camp there, so I didn't want to burst her bubble or scare her. We packed up and I didn't tell her, but let her have a nice memory of deep rest and relaxation while camping on this beautiful property. Was it someone living in the woods? Someone walking down the highway in the middle of the night? Creepy neighbors? Who knows? My mom got a great experience and I got a refund and a fear of camping. The property owner said they might set up cameras to keep an eye on things in the future. People scare more than almost anything else that could be out there. Anyway, listen to your gut. We should have found another campsite or at least a hotel.
This story comes from my first solo backpacking trip in the Spring Mountains in South Nevada. My plan was to do Mount Charleston in 2 days, spending the night, then hitting the peak and then heading down the next day. If you haven't been there, the trail is gorgeous. It winds up around the rim of a big valley before veering down to the summit ridge and offers some amazing views. About 2 miles into the ascent, a faster hiker overtakes me. Rather than just nod and continue on, he stops and matches pace with me, and we strike up a conversation. Nothing particular was weird about what we talked about, but something was just a little off about him. He was too intense, too friendly. His charisma felt almost manic. Have you ever seen that interview with Tom Cruise where he talks about Scientology? This dude was like that, some kind of artificial friendliness. He was the too type A, too glib, almost like he was imitating a genuine reaction. I recall him telling me that he really liked challenging himself, but felt sick because nothing really felt hard or exciting anymore. Nothing really made him hard like it used to. To paraphrase. Well, the Jabberoni's vibe was really freaking me out, so I made an excuse to stop for lunch. The dude kept hiking, and I thought that was the end of it. I had an awesome rest of the day, and as I hiked, he slipped further and further away from my mind. I found a gorgeous campsite on a promontory jetting off from the valley wall and settled in for the night. As night fell, as happens to all of us when we're alone in the backcountry, I started getting squirmy. Full-blown jitters, man. My mind kept jumping back to how weird that guy was, and how he acted like he was just acting how he thought a regular human should. To make it worse, I was cowboy camping. Not even the dubious protection of a nylon between me and a potential terrifying moment of seeing the smiley guy. So, in order to ease my anxious mind before going to bed, I set my fixed blade knife in an easy reach location next to my head. I eventually got to sleep after listening to a few episodes of Mike Ducan's The History of Rome podcasts. I slept unusually sound, not waking once the whole night. When I woke in the morning, I felt unusually content and well rested. That is until I went to grab my stove out of my pack. The location of my pack wasn't the issue. It was where I had left it, leaning against a pine about 5 feet from my pad. No, what really freaked me out was that every single pocket was open, all the zippers unzipped, all the snap closures unwrapped. The sleeping bag compartment was open, the interior mesh components were open, the buckle closure on my stuff sacks were clicked open. Inside the bag nothing was taken, and the bag hadn't been moved, but literally every pocket was open. I wiggled, dude. I had made sure that they were all closed the night before. I'm meticulous with my gear. Someone had opened them. In a panic, I looked down to where my knife lay on the ground next to my pad. Sure enough, the snap closure that held it to its sheath had been snapped open. Let me tell you, brother, I set the fucking land speed record hauling ass off that mountain. When I was on a solo trip in the mountain about 8 kilometers out, I was well off trail and set up on a ridge line. Full moon and no one around for many miles. At about 2 in the morning, I heard some noises. I knew it wasn't an animal, so I woke up, and when I listened further, it sounded like footsteps that were getting closer. I poked my head out my tent, and I could make a bunch of figures out as they were coming my way, walking in single file. There was maybe 10 of them. It didn't make sense that it was a group hiking. Not there at that time. They got closer, and they all had similar military-style big backpacks, no headlamps. As the first guy got close, I said, "Hey." He replied, and kept walking. They were all Hispanic, and they didn't even look at me. Eyes straight forward. Then they were gone. I was like, what the hell is this? And then it dawned on me. They must have been harvesting some sort of illegal harvest. This happened about 14 years ago. I have to say it was absolutely terrifying at the time, but now it makes me laugh. Me and my partner were camping in the woods near a location in upstate New York. We set up camp and had eaten already, and decided to go for a short hike and smoke. It's very hilly in that area, and we found a hill with a sharp drop-off that we could sit on top of and enjoy the sunset while sharing a joint. This whole time, it had been very peaceful and quiet. We were chatting until it got pretty dark. But we knew how to get back to camp, so we weren't too worried. Then, all of a sudden, from our left we heard something big running straight at us extremely fast. We honestly didn't even have enough time to act as a sprinting deer appeared out of nowhere and jumped straight over our head and continues running down the hill. We were pretty speechless, as it was hard to accept what had just happened, especially in our impaired state. So yeah, we got scared to death by a deer. I hope that continues to be the scariest backcountry story that I have to share. I had this happen in Zion once. As a hunter, I'm pretty used to walking around and then suddenly out of nowhere some animal comes tearing ass out of the bush and it startles you. I was hiking out in my usual area, I think I was going to the overlook that I usually hang out in, and it was my last hike of the day. After doing many other things, I was bloody tired. So before I started the elevation, I stopped and grabbed a snack out of my bag and was messing with my water bottle. All with my head down, just keeping the trail in my view to make sure I was moving in the right direction. So I got the lid off and stopped to take a big drink. When I brought the bottle down, there was some species of deer, 2 of them standing right next to me, about 4 feet away. They must have been used to hikers, maybe being fed, because they just stood there and stared at me. I have to say, this was the biggest jump scare I have ever had whilst hiking. They were absolutely motionless, silent, and just staring. I was camped at the base of a mountain, and was up late getting pictures of the night sky. It was probably about 1 in the morning or so, and I suddenly see this light come on about halfway up the mountain, and it was panning back and forth. The light was not anywhere near the climbing route on the mountain, and in a place that I'm fairly sure would be really unstable and quite inaccessible. The only reasonable way I think someone would be in this location is if someone went the really wrong way on a climb. It's a big steep mixed ice and loose cheddar face. It looks kind of like a person that's trying to signal for help. I was not equipped for glacier travel, so I couldn't really go try to investigate even if I wanted to. I was also 2 days away from any help with no cell phone reception. The next day I told a few climbers I saw approximately where the location was when I saw the light, and told them to keep an eye out for someone. And I called SNR as soon as I got back to the car, but I never found out if a person was ever found or rescued. About 10 years ago, I was camping in a park out in Ontario. It wasn't even backcountry, just car camping. It was late, and my girlfriend and I were down by the shore of a small lake having some wine, and we heard a distant but loud mechanical noise. We looked in the direction of the noise and saw a very bright light illuminating in the trees about a kilometre off, coming in our direction, but not directly. Neither of us said anything, but we were both watching. It was fast and passed about 500 meters distance. As it was approaching, the noise got almost deafening, and it became clear to me that it was a train, but it was exceptionally bright. So I was still a little puzzled. It wasn't until the next day that the obvious occurred to me. A train passing through a park makes absolutely no sense. There aren't any tracks. Still, I have no idea what the hell it was. During my first summer in BC in 2019, I traveled around for 3 months with Dora the Ford Explorer, my converter camper car. It was late September. Things had significantly slowed down in terms of tourism and travelers, and I often found myself the only person on the trails. In the backcountry and in campgrounds, especially midweek. I had just camped a couple of days in a remote corner of Wells Grape Provincial Park and decided to drive towards 100 Mile House and from there slowly make my way back south, heading towards Vancouver Island. As I was tired and the sunset was about an hour away, I decided to turn off onto one of the dirt roads, drive another 30 minutes and just park the car by one of the lakes I saw on the map. I saw an amazing sunset, heard wolves howl in the distance, and got a nice fire going to keep me warm. Once again, I felt this deep sense of bliss coming over me, as I had so many times that summer when out in the middle of nowhere by myself. I was enjoying my glass of wine, fire, and complete darkness around me when I heard the humming sounds of a car in the distance. Immediately, anxiety kicked in for the very first time in those 3 months. I had covered about 4,500 kilometers with my Dora and had taken her on the craziest mountain roads, ran into so many different people on the trails, had wildlife encounters and slept in the back country, but never had I ever felt this deep sense of fear before. My heart was pounding and my mind was racing. This was a dead-end road, so there was a big chance that this car was going to stop here. I'm still amazed to this day at how anxiety makes your brain do weird things, because I suddenly had images of a creepy loner in a beat-up truck that always had wanted to kill someone turning up, and here I was, a solo woman in her early 30s, in the middle of nowhere, parked by the side of some random lake. While I always leave trip plans for hikes and backcountry adventures, I had been a bit lax about letting people know where I'd camp for the night with Dora, so nobody would have ever known where I was. I heard the vehicle approaching and saw its lights through the trees. I ran back to my truck, grabbed my axe and closed all the doors and crouched behind the dark side of Dora, away from the burning fire so whoever was coming this way couldn't see me. There were several clearings around the lake, so I just hoped that this person would drive to the further side and leave me alone. I thought I was going to lose it when the car literally pulled up next to Dora on the other side of the fire. For a second I thought of just walking up there like I'd do any other day, just greeting a fellow camper that probably thought it would be nice to share the fire, but for some reason I couldn't even move. All I could think was, don't expose yourself. In nanoseconds I thought, which way should I run if I have to? And then, shit, it's dark. I don't even think I can run through the trees without breaking my ankle or running into one. I heard the other car's door open and somebody stepped out of the car. By this time I almost shit myself. I didn't want to make my presence known because I didn't want this person to walk around my car and find me there crouching on the floor with my axe. So I decided to open the driver's door and then slammed my door shut again really hard, thinking it would sound very masculine and strong. At once I heard the car door closing shut again, the engine start, and I saw it taking off and heading to the furthest end of the lake. I quickly put my fire out and jumped back in my car. Never have I been happier to have a camper set up in my car than that night, for I would not have been able to sleep in my tent. I slept extremely bad that night. I kept waking up to sounds and keep checking on whether I locked my doors. At one point I remember hearing my doors open and panic rushed through my body. How did they get in? All I saw were two dirty hands holding my pillow and pushing it over my face. I woke up drenched in sweat, breathing heavily. To this day, it's one of the scariest and most realistic nightmares that I have ever had. That morning I rushed off as soon as the sun had risen. To this very day I don't know who pulled up next to me on that evening, and I wonder if I gave that person the same scare that they gave me, given the fact that they had rushed off to the other side of the lake. I do know the mind can play tricks on us, especially when we're alone in the wilderness, yet at the same time I do feel our gut feeling warns us for a reason sometimes. Anyway, it's a amusing story, and I do try to tell people now where I plan to stay overnight, even if it's only a quick decision thing. I'm an avid fisherman, and I like to look for new, out-of-the-way fishing holes. If I'm on a trip and have all of my gear, I pull up a map, look at the different connecting waterways, and try to find back roads that may lead to a spot that few people know about. On one of those said trips about 10 years ago, I'm in the western PA and I'm looking for a road to connect me with this small and out-of-the-way stream that I found on a map. I'm in the country. It's not too desolate, but houses are definitely getting further and further apart, and looking more and more beat up. I summarize that I'm really close to where the stream is supposed to be, so I turn down a dirt road that leads towards a tree line in the direction I believe this stream to be. The road starts out in okay shape, but as soon as I pass onto the tree line, stuff gets weird. It's mid-afternoon, but the canopy of the tree is so thick that it suddenly looks like dusk. Then the road very quickly deteriorates, starting to close in and then vanish. There are banks on either side of me, so I figure I'm on some sort of old logging road that rarely, if ever, gets vehicles on it anymore. The road, if you could call it that, is getting worse and worse. Large rocks start appearing at random spots on the trail, and while it starts sporadically, it starts to become more and more often, and seems to be quite unnatural looking. It looks like these were placed here on purpose. My car is a four-wheel drive, but I'm getting a little worried because the rocks are getting larger, and combined with this, how tight the road is now, and driving around them is becoming sketchy. I'm, at this point, driving very slow, trying not to pop a tire or make a wrong move and get stuck in a bank or something. The road suddenly takes a very sharp left-hand and downward turn. I creep along, this turn, but stop as I see the road continuing this weird downward motion. At this moment, my guts start talking to me and telling me to turn around, but at this point I realize I can't. The road is not wide enough to do a 3-point turn. I could chance it, but I don't want to get the front of my truck stuck in something, or falling over the bank, or my back end going in the other direction, getting stuck. I tell myself that I need to keep pushing forward, and I hope that I'm bound to just get enough room to turn around. As I make my way driving this weird downward road with sharp curves and oddly placed rocks, I start seeing items off to the side of the road. First, it's just garbage, bottles, boxes, wrappers, etc. Then I start seeing toys, kids' toys, and I mean lots of them. An uncomfortable amount. Then I start seeing clothes. Some look old and withered, like they've been there for years, but some look fairly new. The amount of clothes I'm seeing also increase. Then I start seeing mattresses. Not one random mattress, but loads of mattresses all over the place. There are dirty and dark stains all over them. My gut is now screaming at me, telling me to get the fuck out, but I still don't have the room to turn around. While I'm sitting there trying to figure out my next move, I get that distinct feeling that I'm being watched. The moment that feeling hits me, I audibly yell at myself, "Hell no." Then I slam the car in reverse and just reverse dodge all of the random rocks on my way back up. And I keep doing that until it levels out again. I go full fuck this mode and risk making a 3-point turn. My back end goes slightly off the bank and I back in and drove with my foot on the gas to throw myself back onto the road and out of whatever dark woods bullshit I had just discovered. I have no clue what happened across that day, but best case scenario, I was probably deep in some wood meth den. All I know is that ever since then, no matter what I'm doing, the moment my gut starts telling me to get out, I get the fuck out. These events occurred 2 summers ago in the Grand Trenton area. My partner at the time, whom I'm now married to, was an avid outdoorsman and also served the military. I was an ecology major and wanted to spend more time outdoors, so they decided to take me on my first backpack trek. Just the 2 of us. For those who aren't familiar, the Grand Trenton area are well known for their wildlife, specifically grizzly bears. My only experience with a bear to this point was watching a little black bear cross the road from the safety of my car. Seeing grizzly country signs around every corner wasn't doing much to calm my nerves. Well, this is the first incident. My partner looked like someone from an Indiana Jones movie, machete hanging from their belt, large knives attached to each side of their pack, bear spray strapped to their waist. You get the picture. The beginning of our 20-mile journey was uphill. When in Bear County, You're supposed to make noise as not to startle the wildlife by accidentally sneaking up on them. As you can imagine, going up a steep hill while carrying 40-pound backpacks, it's kind of difficult to make conversation. We were an hour in and almost at the top of the ascent. I noticed that the woods had gone completely silent, save for the rushing streams that were toward the left side of the trail. Silent woods are never a good sign. It usually shows that there are predators nearby. At this point, I was in front of my partner and we were about to crest the hill. For the past 20 minutes, we had not said a word to each other, having been too tired to speak. We noticed the silence at the same time and gave each other knowing glances. I came up over the top of the hill and froze the second I got there. Sitting not 10 feet in front of me in the middle of the trail was a fucking grizzly bear. My partner wasn't aware yet as they were behind me, so I did the first thing I could think of. While still in my frozen stance, I managed to take my arm and start flinging it wildly behind me, trying to get their attention. I was too terrified to speak. The bear went from sitting to being on all fours, not looking away from us. My partner quickly swung me around so that I was behind them, and they started yelling. Being in the military, they know how to yell. The grizzly wasn't fazed at all, as it started walking slowly towards us. At this point, I was on the verge of passing out from terror. This bear was about 5 feet in front of us when we heard a loud crack coming from the woods to our right. The bear heard it too, and he bolted towards the stream. A second crack boomed again, this time much closer than before. My partner said it was probably falling branches or something, but we both knew that that wasn't the case. At this point, we were walking quickly up the trail in an attempt to create some distance from the grizzly and those strange noises. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand straight up, and at the same moment my partner stopped moving in front of me. They turned around to look at me and turned to look behind me. To this day, we are not sure what we saw. Back where we were standing was a large, black, brown mass. It looked to be 3 times bigger than the already large grizzlies that we had just seen a few moments before. Its back was facing us, and then it stood on its back legs. It looked similar to a bear, but something about the shape was off. At this point, it was probably stupid to run away, but that's exactly what we did. We were aware of heavy footsteps behind us, but neither of us looked back. The footsteps eventually faded. At this point, I was a mess. My partner was doing her best to console me. They told me that it was extremely unusual and bears usually stay away from humans, saying that we were going to be okay. I'm sure that this won't happen again, etc. And that was enough to convince me to continue on the trail. Not another hour later, we reached a clearing where we decided to take a rest and eat a snack. About a minute after we sat down, I noticed bushes moving in a line towards the clearing, towards us. Out of the brush comes this adolescent grizzly who looks as spooked as I am. He came straight for us. My partner, being the crazy nut that they are, decided to charge back at the bear while screaming, the bear spray at the ready. That did the trick and the bear ran off. All I could think was just my luck, but that wasn't even close to the scary things that happened on the second night. So, second incident. Before we began our trek, we had to let the ranger station know which trail routes we were planning to take. With this information, they usually send a ranger on horseback at some point during the trail to check on you to make sure that everything is okay. There were not many approved trails left for us to choose from, and it was just our luck that they were the most difficult. Apparently, over the 3 days we were on those trails, we had been the sole hikers. We didn't see a single other person while we were en route. Anyhow, I guess we missed the ranger who came to check on us. We had been following hoof prints the entire second day, and we hadn't seen anything the day before. I had some foot problems, so we spent a valuable part of the daylight trying to adjust my boot laces and socks to compensate for the pain. When we started on the trail again, we had maybe an hour or two of daylight left, and in the woods, it gets dark very fast. I was exhausted. It was now dark out, and my partner was the only one with a working headlamp, as mine wouldn't even turn on for some stupid reason. We needed to find somewhere to set up camp, as we still needed to eat. It was freezing and the wind was blowing. It was creating a howling sound as it rushed through the trees, which made it difficult to hear my partner or discern any other sounds coming from the woods. After another hour of hiking through the dark, we found a clearing. Well, it was more like a bowl. It looked to be around 20 meters in diameter, with sides being 10 meters down from the trail to the bottom of the clearing. This place was strange. We both felt it, though. My partner didn't tell me how freaked out they were until after we had left. There was no moonlight, so all we had was the illumination from their headlight, our small camping stove, and the flashlight that I fished from my backpack. Half of the trees were dead, fallen, just in the bowl. The vegetation everywhere else was very dense. To help elevate my anxiousness, my partner started playing the song Ninja Sex Party out of their portable speaker. This didn't help much, as it just echoed off the trees, creating a dissonance of sounds. My partner, though, thought that it would wear off any predators that maybe were lurking around. This is when we knew our anxiousness wasn't paranoia. The silence was back. There hadn't been a single bird chirp since we arrived at the clearing. It also may have had to do with the obnoxious music, but because of our earlier experience, we decided to turn off the music and head into the tent. Also, it was bloody freezing. As soon as we were situated in our sleeping bags, we heard deep cracks and thuds echoing from beyond the tree line. We assumed it was to be falling trees or something. There had been a lot of wildfires and very little rain this season. Suddenly, thud, we both froze. That sound wasn't an echo. It came from inside the clearing, definitely not a falling tree. Thud. It came from right outside our tent. We both stopped breathing. My partner's hand found mine, and we clung to each other, paralyzed. Something dragged across the outside of our tent, making an indent as it went along outside of our tent, making an indent as it did so. It was thin, almost like a finger. "What is it?" I whispered, shaking. "I don't know. There shouldn't be a person out there, as we're the only ones on this side of the mountain," my partner replied. I was trying my hardest to just not cry, trying to listen to what was outside. I could hear steps but couldn't decipher what it was. The steps stopped, and then the whole side of the tent was slowly pushed inward. At this point, whatever was outside our tent knew we were in there, so I shined my flashlight at the side of the tent, and what I saw made my blood run cold. It was the shape of a human face pressed into our tent wall. I could make out the nose, a gaping mouth. Each time they breathed, it made the tent around their mouth billow in and out. My partner said, "Fuck that," and pulled out his Glock from his sleeping bag. He cocked it, and the sound shattered the silence. The face pulled back, and we heard fast footsteps heading towards the edge of the clearing. We didn't leave the tent until the sun was shining the next morning. The first thing we noticed was the smell of urine. We came out of the tent and looked around. Whoever it was had peed on our coals that we had left in the fire, leaving a disgusting stench of evaporated pee. Footprints surrounded our tent, circling around multiple times. Muddy handprints decorated the outside of our tent. We think it was mud. The takeaway we found from this is that wildlife is not the most dangerous thing that you can find in the backcountry. I grew up in Ohio in the 70s, and me and my childhood friend Joe were outside all of the time that we could manage it. Joe lived on a farm that bordered a pretty big forest, and my parents would drop me off in the morning and we'd stay in those woods all weekend. We'd only come out for school. We loved pretending that we were some sort of outdoorsmen. We would build shelters, traps, practice making fire with sticks, the whole 9 yards. When we got to be in high school, we got this notion to pull a Stand By Me. This was based on the movie of the same name that had just come out. The idea was that we'd walk the railroad tracks out in the country, but instead of looking for a dead body, we'd go looking for cool bridges to go fishing off or stuff like that. And maybe even find a place to camp that was a little way off tracks. Of course, we knew that this was dangerous and that we'd likely be trespassing, but we were kids. We had a lot of fun. We did find beautiful rivers. We discovered bridges that no one went to and fished. We hid from trains. At night we camped in the woods just near the tracks and made small hidden fires. Nothing bad ever happened. It was idyllic. In fact, it was so fun we did it multiple times and never had a problem. After high school, Joe and I went our ways, We both left home, but we always stayed in touch and always tried to coordinate visits so that we would be able to see each other occasionally. Well, one summer in the mid-90s, it worked out that we were both in town for about a week. We'd do stuff with family in the day, and at night we'd either catch drinks at a bar or sit outside Joe's house around the fire and talk about the old days. One night, Joe and I got talking about our Stand By Me trips. Well, nostalgia and beer are one hell of a mix. Soon we decided to take a day, walk the rails, camp at night, and then walk home. So the day came. We started out on our early morning trip. We had my wife drop us off at our old spot where we used to start, right outside our hometown. She thought this was absolutely crazy, and she made sure to mention it. When she pulled away, Joe suggested that instead of walking the usual route, we'd take the opposite direction, just to be adventurous. We knew the land well, we had a map, so I gave a what the hell, and, well, off we went. The day went fine. It was fun and a little sad, but in a good way. We found a bridge and sat on the edge, smoked a joint and moved on. We had no fishing gear, but we brought some canned food and other stuff. Before night started setting in, we picked a spot to camp. It was a thick forested area, trees on every side of the train tracks, so you felt like you were in a tunnel. We had brought small hammocks to sleep on, but before we set them up, we decided to do a little bit of scouting around the perimeter. Now, this is something that we used to do in the old days too. We'd walk around the area just a little bit to make sure some dude's house wasn't just over a hill and we were actually camping in their yard. We walked maybe 100 feet into the woods and up a small incline. We figured if we don't see anything from the top of this sort of hill, that would be fine, but when we got to the top, we saw an old building down at the bottom, about 100 yards into the wood. It was barely visible. We pondered over what to do. We both assumed it was a sugar shack or something because there didn't appear to be a clear road to it. From where we were, there didn't look to be anyone in it either. All was quiet, no movement could be seen, no lights. We decided to walk a little closer to make sure. We came down the hill very slowly, and as we neared the building, we saw it wasn't a sugar shack at all. It was an old church. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. It was a squat, sagging building whose wooden planks were almost black from years of moss and rot. A cross still stood on top of the place. It was also withered black. None of the windows had glass, and there were no doors, just open doorways. We got close enough to see inside, and there were rows of pews, and a built-up section in front of the preacher's stand. We didn't go all the way in. We didn't want to. Beyond all that, there was no sign of anyone else, no footprints, no paths, no road. It was an abandoned church. We left at once and went back up the hill to our spot that we had picked for camping. Having the hill between us and the church made us feel better, but we were still a little uneasy. We chalked it up to a natural case of creepiness, seeing the church in the middle of the woods. You know, the normal feelings it would elicit. Besides, at this point it was dusk, and we just decided to ring up our hammocks and go to sleep, and then move on early in the morning. Night set in, and as we lay in our hammocks and shot the shit, we began to hear something in the direction of the church. Our conversation about it went on like this. Do you hear that? What the fuck is that? It sounds like people singing. And it did sound like singing. We both slid right out of our hammocks and hunkered down, straining to hear more. We listened for a minute or two and the singing continued, but it wasn't getting louder. Finally, we decided to creep back up the hill and see if we could spy where the sound was coming from. We could still move very quietly in the woods from the old days. It was second nature to us. The moon was barely out, but it supplied enough light so you wouldn't walk right into a tree, but it was near pitch black. We didn't use flashlights as we crept slowly up the hill, and we didn't talk. When we got to the top, we saw light in the distance. It was coming from the church, and the singing was coming from inside. Joe and I put our heads close together and had a hushed conversation that boiled down to, can you believe this shit? The light looked to be candlelight from the way it flickered, and though we tried, we couldn't make out what was being sung. It sounded like church music, but in another language. We sat and watched for a while, trying to see who was there, but we only saw occasional shadows. We had no intention of getting closer either. We had about a football field's length between us, and we aimed to keep it that way. The singing continued for a bit, and then it stopped. After that, a booming male voice began to chant. I was already freaked out, but this voice thoroughly scared the shit out of me. It sounded like some Old Testament preacher you see in the movies, but again it was like he was speaking in a different language because we couldn't understand a single word. Eventually it got to where the single male voice would say something and a bunch of voices would answer in song. This lasted for a while, and then they broke into this long sustained wail that just kept getting louder. It got so loud and so disturbing that I covered my ears, then it stopped. At this point I was getting ready to say, let's get the fuck out of here, when Joe put his hand on my shoulder and hissed, they're coming out. We were far enough away that we couldn't make them out very well, but we could see a line of figures walk out the open doorway, all holding hands in single file. We could see that some of them had flashlights. They began to sing again, and the light from the flashlights began to move towards us and the hill. We booked it back down to our campsite, grabbed our shit and ran to the tracks. Once there, we ran down the tracks in the direction that we had come from. After a few minutes we stopped and looked back. We saw lights coming down the hill. They were moving erratically, like whoever was holding them was shaking it. We continued to run in spurts and walk just as fast as we could. We eventually stopped seeing the lights and came to a road. By our map we knew a small town was about 15 minutes down, and we walked there and got to a 24-hour gas station, to which we then called my wife to come and get us. My wife and the other friends all just thought it was kids messing around, but I heard those voices and they sure as hell didn't sound like kids to me. Not sure who those people were, but it was definitely the creepiest thing that happened to me out in the woods. This happened when I was growing up around 2004 or 2005. I was about 13 years old. It took place in a rural area, a good way out of the old town, Uverdale, Texas. The town itself was really small back then and not much to look at. It's just one of those towns that really isn't in the way to anywhere important. My father knew someone who owned a deer lease that was about 1,000 acres, I think, down outside the area. They were complaining about a ton of hogs that were tearing up their land. Being open season on the hogs in the south, my dad thought that he would surprise me that summer and take me down for a week to go hunting for them. Not only did that help him with networking for his job, but it also gave us some quality father-son time. I remember the drive down from Dallas was torture. It was about 7 hours in my dad's hard-top Jeep Wrangler. That car was so uncomfortable, I fucking hated it. All I had to do on that trip was either stare out the window or try to beat Super Mario Island 2 on my Game Boy Pocket, something I was never able to accomplish in my youth. The drive obviously took most of the day, so we get there in the early evening. The owner of the land had told my dad that he hadn't had anyone lease it that year yet, and the cabin in the property may be a little rough and dusty. I didn't really care at this point in my life. I had been in Scouts for a couple of years and spent a lot of my free time in the woods, doing the usual thing, or I would be out fishing with my friends. Needless to say, I was pretty comfortable roughing it. So after unlocking the gate and driving to the cabin on the land, we settled in. The cabin was pretty rough, dust and dirt everywhere, flies. I remember that it looked like some raccoons had gotten into the cabin and crapped on the floor. After cleaning up a bit and getting the sleeping bags out, then setting up the cots, we decided to sleep. Something about that night was weird. I was never able to get comfortable enough to fall asleep for any restful amount. I couldn't put my finger on why, but I had that feeling of being watched. I was finally able to drift off for what I guessed was about an hour, maybe. When I woke up, it was early, about 7 a.m. We decided to scout around the land for tracks and signs of hogs to find a good place to set up a blind. It was the summer and horribly hot in the afternoon, so the morning was the best time to be out and about. After walking for about an hour or so, we came across to an area of trees, lightly dense, and luckily found some sign of hogs. Typical torn up ground where they had been rooting as we followed them into the trees. I was looking for more signs when my dad stopped me with his arm. I remember looking up and seeing someone standing about 50 yards away. Some of their body was blocked by trees. This was private land, so they definitely weren't supposed to be there. We also had confirmation from the owner before we got to the lease that nobody was there. Not to mention, the gate was locked up when we first arrived. The person was wearing some bright-colored red jacket. We slowly walked towards them. My dad called out something like, "Hey, we're hunters, this is private land." The person didn't move at all, dead still. We were about 30 yards away and could see that he had turned away from us with his hands in his pocket. Weird thing was that this person was in a ski jacket and what looked to be ski pants. Now, this is Texas in the summer. It was about 98 outside by then. My dad called out again, no reaction. He told me to stay behind him and unsnapped the clip to his pistol holder. That's all that we had at the time since we were only scouting the area. the rifles were tucked away back in the cabin. We approached the person's right side, and then my dad told me to stay put, about 20 yards away. I stayed and crouched down, watching him circle around to the form of a man, all the while talking to him, asking if he was okay. He finally passed around to the form of the man, and my dad stood straight up with confusion. I called out, asking what was wrong, and he called back saying that it was a mannequin. I walked over to it while my dad stood there, staring, and as I got closer, one thing stood out the most. The clothes it was wearing were brand new. No dust, no sap, no bird droppings or signs of being outside for more than a day at the most. At that moment I looked at my dad and I could see him get worried. Almost at once after, I felt that feeling again, like we were being watched, and I knew my dad felt it too. I wanted to start crying. I remember feeling suddenly scared. My dad whispered to me that we were leaving. He grabbed my hand and drew his pistol. He scanned the area the whole way back while I was trying to hold back panicked tears. We got back as fast as we could. I was terrified. So it felt like an eternity, but in reality it was about 45 minutes at max. After returning, we packed up and beat feet. We drove back home that day and didn't talk much about what had happened on the way back. I remember right after we left, my dad called his buddy, the owner of the land, and he was confused. He said that he would go check it out next week when he was in the area. He also said that he had never had issues with people because his property was high fenced. My dad isn't normally a paranoid person, but me being young and the lease possibly having someone there we didn't know, he decided to be cautious and just get out of there. After we got back home, we talked, and my dad wasn't able to sleep the night before as well. He had the same feeling but didn't want to wake me up because he thought I was sleeping too. Turns out the next week he got a call from his buddy and he checked the whole property and never found any trace of anyone. No mannequin or anything. The story still makes my hair stand on end. No idea what that was, but the paranoid man in me thinks that it was some kind of trap or something. Not the creepiest thing that happened to me in the woods, but definitely top 3. So, whoever was out there, I'm glad we never met. I used to work on the north slope of Alaska in the oil industry. The work we were doing required us to travel far out into Alaska, into its reserve, which is basically just untamed tundra wilderness for hundreds of miles. The oil companies would build these long ice roads in the winter that would lead to exploration drilling pads. Our job was to go out after they finished the first drilling and test rock formations for their oil-producing qualities. It was mid-January. The sun hadn't quite come up yet, and when I say that the sun hadn't come up yet, I mean it hadn't come up in almost a month and a half. Polar nights are intense. The particular well site we were traveling to was about 60 miles west of Alpine, Alaska, deep in the wilderness. Our job took a week, but we finished and were heading back to camp to finish our hitch and go home. At the beginning and end of the ice roads are guard shacks that you have to click in, and out of for safety. If you didn't check in or out at a set time, they would come looking for you to ensure that you were not a popsicle. This whole thing was set up because there was no cell service in between the distance of the well and the check-in points. It was about 4 in the morning, not that it mattered, in the land of endless night, and we were halfway across the ice road. Travel was slow, as the speed limit on the road is only about 25 miles per hour, when something appeared on the road in our headlights. It was a man, in jeans, sneakers, and a hoodie, walking down the ice road in the wilderness tundra at 4 a.m. It was 20 degrees outside. It's not unusual for local Inuit people to be out here this far hunting. Maybe their snowmobile had broken down and they were trying to get back. I remember thinking. It seemed plausible. He didn't acknowledge us as our trucks rolled up next to him. He just kept shuffling forward. He didn't seem cold. His clothes were totally not appropriate for the extreme weather. Yet he appeared warm and dry. We also noticed that he wasn't Inuit, but Caucasian. I rolled down my window and asked if he needed help and if he was okay. He still didn't acknowledge us, just kept shuffling forward. His face was completely blank, devoid of any thought or emotion. The other guys in my truck suggested that maybe he was in an accident and in shock. I continued rolling my truck alongside him as he trudged down the road, still trying to get his attention. Even in this extreme cold, I could occasionally get whiffs of a peculiar smell coming from him. He smelled acidic, if that makes sense. There was just a lot about this guy that made the hair on my neck stand up. The guy behind me in the truck's crew cab had enough of all of this. He rolled down his window and reached out to grab the guy. He later said he was just gonna try to shake him out of his stupor. Before my buddy's hand could reach him, though, this walking popsicle spun around and latched onto my buddy's outstretched arm. He glared at my buddy and then at me, with this look of pure rage, not removing his hand from his arm. If emotions had a physical temperature, this guy could have melted the entire tundra that night. My buddy groaned in pain as he tried to get his arm free from Mr. Popsicle. At that moment, this guy starts screaming in our faces. There was so much hate and rage and anger in the scream. It was absolutely terrifying. I slammed on the gas and spun out of the ice for a second before the wheels caught and latched us forward. Popsicle Dude still had a hold of my body's arm and was trying to pull him out of the truck. He was running alongside the truck while the other guys in the cab held on to my buddy to keep him inside. After several moments, my buddy tore free from this guy and we hauled ass to the guard shack, which was another 30 miles down the road. We checked with the guards and reported what we had just seen. The guard was looking at us like we were pulling a prank, but policy said that they had to check it out regardless. My buddy's arm was sore, and when he pulled back his sleeve, there were noticeable bruises in the shape of hands around his arms. We filed a report with the guard and were told to head back to our camp. None of us really wanted to talk about what had happened, and it was a quiet drive the rest of the way. We flew home the next day. The next time we saw the guard at the shack, we asked him if he ever saw Mr. Popsicle on his patrol. He told us that they searched up and down that ice road for a solid 12-hour shift and saw nothing, not even tracks in the snow leading off the road. He told us that it was a good prank and that he'd get us back for making him waste his shift driving around. But it wasn't a prank. Who would make up a story like that, and who would willingly bruise their arm for a dumb prank? We never got a satisfying answer to what happened that evening. I still wonder about that dude, if he even was a dude. The Alaskan tundra is a weird place, and that was just one of my many weird stories from my time up there. I'll work to write down more experiences and share them later.